Welcome. What is Titan? A no-code platform for Salesforce. What can you do with Titan? You can build forms, portals, document generation, e-signatures, maps, automation, and a lot more. Security is really important to us. Therefore, we are HIPAA compliant, PCI SSC compliant, GDPR 508, and ISO compliant. So, what are you waiting for? Schedule a demo with us at Form Titan and let us build the impossible for Salesforce.
We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.
So hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to find your SHEro voice here at Virtual Dreaming. I have spent 35 years, 2 decades of life in professional voice use. I've done 35 years as a voice trainer, as someone who's trained my own voice, 15 years as a professional opera singer, and then 17 years as a functional voice coach. And through all of that time and all of that experience, do you know what I get asked most of all? Like the question or questions that people really want to know from a functional voice coach who used to be an opera singer. They want to know, are women's voices shrill? More shrill than men's, certainly. Or are they grating? Or maybe they're just aggressive. Or, of course, they might just be annoying. That must be it, right? So what exactly is going on here? And I think it would surprise nobody who has come to a presentation on female voice to know that female voices are scrutinized in public to a much higher degree than male voices. We are always in the public eye in a very specific way. Our ways that we enter the world are graded on a different curve. So when we look at what it is that's happening, we see that there are a lot of societal factors, and some of those societal factors are out of our control, and some of them are not necessarily just being subjected upon women by men. Some of these things, some of these descriptions are being used towards women by women. So one of the things that I want you thinking about as we're going through this course today is not only what are your perceptions of your voice and how it enters the world, but also what are your perception of other women's voices? How is it that you see and hear other women when they enter the room? And not in a way that you judge yourself harshly or that you say, oh, I can't believe I'm doing that, or any of that. I just want you to have a thought of awareness for how it is that you're interpreting both your voice and other women's voices. And as we go through, I'm going to throw out a lot of stuff that's science, a lot of stuff that's about physiology. We're going to talk a lot about perception, and you might have questions as we go along. I hope you do. And if you do, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Right now, I'm going to invite a question from you. And if questions come into the chat box during the presentation, we're going to go ahead and stop and address some of those things or try to lace them in to the presentation. But we will have time at the very end for a 10-minute Q&A. So that's just one of those things that I want to make sure that everybody knows. I am here to answer those questions as we go on the fly. All right, so let's talk about what is going on here. It could be just societal. It could be just a misogyny, you know, the elephant in the room, the misogyny that's in our society. but perhaps there's something else at work. And for us to really discover what it is, we're going to have to go right to the beginning. And the beginning is in utero, because the very first voice every single human being will ever hear is their mother's voice. In utero, a fetus starts hearing at 18 weeks. And sound, as it comes into the womb, is very muffled. It sounds as if the fetus is underwater, because of course it is. It's completely encircled by water. But there's one sound in this very loud environment that is the loudest of all, that is the most singular sound. And that sound is the sound of the mother's voice. Now, when babies are born, that voice becomes the single quickest recognizable sound in their universe. And it means two things. It means constancy, that tether, that connection from their life before to their life outside. And it also means safety. The authority in the room for every one of us on day one, minute one, hour one, is female. So what happened? So what exactly happens? How do things turn that we end up having a little bit of a different shift in paradigm when we get into not even just our adult lives, but a time where young girls and teenagers, we see how our voices are perceived differently in space. So what happens along the way? One of those things that happened is cultural. And here in the United States, that cultural shift happened with the advent of AM radio. Okay, so that might be a little strange, right? But AM radio was this very, very cool thing that came into prominence in the early 20th century. So about 1913 to 1923 was this advent of AM radio. And it was very, very cool. Everybody started to be able to hear this broadcast entertainment in their home. But here's the thing about AM radio. Before AM radio, women's voices in public were very different here in the States. As a matter of fact, we had telephone operators, and to work as a telecom operator, that was a very nicely paid job. You had to either be female or be able to sound female, because people wouldn't actually take direction or instruction or assistance from male voices. So up until this point, female voices are the voices of direction and help and authority. That hasn't changed so much. If you use a digital device in your home, you're calling it Siri or Alexa or Cortana. All of those things still remain true, but enter AM radio, and what happened was that it started using a lot of bandwidth. It started taking up a lot of space. And Congress actually put forward a set of laws controlling how much bandwidth AM radio could use. And so the radio stations had a very simple solution. They were going to reduce the bandwidth so that it happened to be between 300 and 350 hertz. That seems like a random bandwidth, but it is the bandwidth in which a low male voice sounds amazing. Guess whose voices don't sound so good between 300 and 350 hertz? The female voice, when it's projecting and in its most positive sound wave, sounds the most amazing between 5,000 and 7,000 hertz. So when we got into the situation where female voices had to compete against a voice that had an acoustical advantage based on the bandwidth, we'd get into the room, the microphone would start creating all of this feedback because it couldn't take the frequency of our voices, and the sound engineers didn't know what to do about it, so they'd crank up the volume. And so what was coming out of the radio was this velvety sounding male voice and this very high pitched thing that sounded really aggressive, shrill, grating, annoying. Those words started there, and they stayed with us because what we're doing is repeating. We're creating a mimicry of the words that we've been told are appropriate for female voice, rather than the voices that we truly believe are appropriate for female voice. But more about that later. What happens next is that women start entering the workforce in different ways. So they're not telecom operators anymore. Those jobs start going to men. And they're not necessarily just teachers and nurses anymore. They're going into active workplaces. And to accompany us in this new entry into a world environment where we might have thoughts and power and just a sense of being in public, we were accompanied by TV programs that created caricatures of women who were silly and aggressive and annoying. And, I'm picking the character of Lucille Ball from I Love Lucy as an example, but she was just one of a lot of characters that were put on to be extreme examples of the periphery of the female experience rather than showing women as they were entering the workforce. These things tend to shift how people perceive not just other people, but themselves. So what's in a voice anyway? I want to talk a little bit about what is actually happening when we make sound. And the reason this is important is because I think we don't spend a lot of time understanding how our bodies work. We don't spend a lot of time understanding how a voice enters the room and what it's doing in the room. And for most of us, we spend most of our time just trying to figure out what to say, when to say it, and whether we should say it. So those are the things that sometimes we're navigating. And if you have other things around voice experience that you'd like to bring up now, please put it in the chat and Deepa will interrupt me with the question. But we're going to move into a little bit of the physiology of voice. So when you want to say something, the very first thing that happens is that you decide you're going to say something. You set an intention. I want to tell you about all of these cool work around things for voice. And so I am going to talk to you about neurological charge. And so I think about that. Those words start coalescing in my brain and I get a bunch of neurological charge. And this image that you're seeing here is what those neurons look like when they're firing together. It's a rendering rather than a real picture from your brain, but it is a big electrical current that happens in the brain. This electrical current goes through a lot of different places, but the primary place it goes is through the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is one of the most complicated and complex connections between our brain and the rest of our body in terms of the parts of the nervous system that fire together. The vagus nerve is taking care of our swallow, how much saliva is in our mouth. It's taking care of the vocal cords themselves and their functions. It is taking care of our heart rate and how much air is coming in and out of the lungs. It's taking care of our digestion, and it's also taking care of parts of our libido. Interestingly enough, it's also firing a response that happens both within the parasympathetic and the sympathetic parts of your neurological system, and that is the flight, freeze response. So those are the things that you need to know about what's happening in the brain. But you think of what you want to say, the brain starts firing like crazy. And then it goes to your vocal cords. Well, the system that your vocal cords are the motor for. So if you look at this rendering, what we're seeing is the connection from your nose and your mouth into the pharynx to where the vocal cords are and where the trachea is. Of course, we have both the trachea and the esophagus that are happening, that are coming into each other parallel. But what we eat should not end up in our lungs, which comes into why the vocal cords are where they are and why they exist in the way they exist. But they function in this very simple way. So when I go to say something, the vocal cords open and close. And as I speak, the air that gets exhaled is the sound. And I think Deepa has a question for me.
I do. So we've been talking about how we talk and we come across with our intentions to talk, right? So the question is, what about talking to myself?
Aha. When you speak to yourself, if you speak to yourself out loud, that intention is still firing, but it fires in a very different way. When we are choosing to speak to ourselves introspectively, if you speak out loud, you're still running the machinery of your outside voice, for lack of a better term. When you're speaking to yourself within your system, that's handled a little bit differently. So when you speak outside in your own voice to yourself, mechanically, it's not very different than when you speak to other people. But neurologically, there are some differences. Does that answer the question? I hope so. All right.
I hope so. It makes sense, right? Because when you speak to yourself, you're not nervous that somebody else is listening. You're just telling yourself what you want to say.
Absolutely. Although it really does depend. So we have to open up the acceptance of a lot of neurological difference. So for example, if I'm a person that suffers from a generalized anxiety disorder, my daughter does. So when she speaks out, even if she's speaking to herself, there is that feeling of trying to sort what's already in her mind. So there might be nervousness there, that the natural anxiety that exists in her sometimes might exist in that voice. So I think we should not necessarily be prescriptive in what should it feel like. It should feel like whatever you feel like. The idea isn't to think that there's a right or wrong, but to understand how your voice enters the room so that you can take the power out of that for your communication.
Cool. I'll let you continue.
Excellent. All right. So these vocal cords, again, they work fairly simply. They close and open, they oscillate, and they do that in cycles per second. So little puffs of oxygen come out of your lungs, they open and close, they make the sounds that I'm making right now and that you are hearing. So in essence, that can seem very, very simple. Your lungs take up this entire upper quadrant of your rib cage. So there's a lot of oxygen to be had. You're taking in this breath, the entire rib cage is opening all the way around you, allowing those lungs to expand all the way around. And at the same time, there's a muscle called the diaphragm that separates your lungs from the other organs in your torso, and it's contracting to move those organs a little bit so you have a little bit more air on the bottom of your lung. So we have a great amount of lung capacity for the task of speech, because of course respiration isn't just for speaking, and importantly, speaking isn't the primary purpose of the vocal cords. So we're going to get to that in just a second. But for the lungs to work efficiently in order to give you the best oxygenation for the best sound, your body has to be in alignment. And why is that? If you look at the image to your left, what you're seeing is that there is a lot of musculature around the rib cage. That musculature has to be able to contract and release in a good equilibrium for that rib cage to fly, for you to get expansion all the way around. The diaphragm itself has to be able to contract for the viscera underneath it to be displaced enough for your lungs to fill in the bottom. And there's a response in the abdominal muscles underneath that to support or resist that motion in the diaphragm. And there's a deeper extension to the lower half of the body because there's a muscle called your psoas, which you're actually able to see towards the back and the spine. It's this long muscle that looks like it's going all the way around the hip. It does. It goes from the base of your spine where it connects to your diaphragm, goes through the notch in our hip bone, because women's hip bones have a little hole, a little notch in them. The psoas goes through that notch and into the back of the legs. So our flexibility, our mobility in the lower half of our body, and especially through our hips, dictates how much air we're getting and how much air energy we can apply to the voice. In essence, what's happening is this. The speaker is exhaling air. That air is sound, and that sound is displacing other air in the room, creating cycles of waves that not only makes the sound audible to the other people in the room, but it also interacts with them subverbally. So that exhale sound, that sound of your voice, that wave that you're creating is not just sound, it's your presence in the room. So this is where we get into my favorite part about how your voice exists. We call the organs, the muscles that make voice, the vocal cords. And I'm going to stop there so that Deepa can ask me a question, but we'll be back. Hi.
It's more than a question.
Hey.
You're getting some compliments, so I wanted to let you know that. One person said, I never knew that that was the purpose of the diaphragm, is keeping my balance. I'm a runner, so it makes sense.
Hey.
Gina, your voice is beautiful, strong, powerful, smooth, but soothing and relaxing as well. So nice to listen to your presentation. And then the last thing is, will you sing your favorite note at the end? So I'm going to promise this person that if we have time left, we're going to give you a chance to sing. So
Okay. I will definitely, time allowing, we will do that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So again, we're talking about what the vocal cords, or the vocal folds, as we call them, are designed to do. So we like to think that because we call them vocal folds or vocal cords, that their purpose is to make this sound, this communication that we embark on a daily basis for some of us. But the purposes, and there are many purposes of the thyroerythenoids, which is their scientific name, are a little bit more survival function-y than that. Survival function, that's not really a word, but they're part of our survival function. So the first thing that the thyroerythenoids do is they are the primary airway. So that is the opening through which air enters through the trachea, through the bronchi, into your lungs. They are the opening. Importantly, they're a pliable opening. They're able to seal completely so that as you swallow, none of the things that are headed for your stomach end up in your lungs. So it seals to make sure that food and drink don't end up in your lungs or any other foreign bodies, but we're hoping that it's just food and drink that is being ingested. The other thing they do is that the thyroerythenoids are a sphincter. So they create a series of musculature movements with other muscles nearby. They don't do this by themselves to regulate air pressure. And they do things that we do every day. So elimination in the body is helped by the vocal cords. And if you have children, childbirth happens because of the air pressure that we can put in the vocal cords. So those are the types of things that are part of the air pressure there. But wait, there's more. So that air pressure that the body can create through the use of the vocal folds, through the thyroerythenoids, can also help us to lift very heavy things. And if you've ever seen a professional weightlifter lift, the thing that they do is, they grunt. And that grunt is called a Valsalvic maneuver. And it is probably the first sound human beings made, is just that grunt. So if you're keeping score, primary airway, seal against food and drink, making sure that we can eliminate and give birth, lifting heavy things, and creating grunt. But there's one more. The vocal folds, the thyroerythenoids, also assist us in dislodging things that are in the lungs. So they help us cough. And that could be because something got past them, or because you have some sort of an infection that needs to get fluid or something out of your lungs. So that's something very apropos of this moment. The cough reflex comes from the thyroerythenoids in conjunction with other musculature. So that's 5 survival functions, things without which you could not live, that are dependent on the thyroerythenoids, on what we call the vocal folds. And then we decided that grunting wasn't enough. At some point, this organism found something so important that it had to make more sound. And there is a theory, which I subscribe to, that grunt became singing and singing became speech. And that theory actually gives us a lot more availability to the question of how we develop so many different language and different ways of speaking. So that there's a lot more accessibility of movement of sound through singing than there is through speech in a great way. So there's a lot of science there. If that's a curiosity of yours, definitely send me an email. We'll talk some more about that. But that is the function of the vocal cords. They have a lot of survival functions before they get to this thing that we call speaking. And so the brain is operating in this situation where it says, okay, all of these survival functions are taken care of, right? Because I hear you talking. Now, for most of us, most of the time, we're not actually in the best alignment. We haven't had the best sleep. We haven't eaten the perfect meals. We're not totally hydrated. We haven't done all the things to make sure that all the survival functions are being met. So the brain gives us resource for speaking because we're highly adaptable organisms, but it doesn't give us everything. So what I'm talking about is, how do you create a life? How do you line up a physiology behind your voice that is so beyond reproach, that is so unassailable, that your brain says, okay, now we're cooking. Here are the resources to do all of the things that the voice can do. And the voice can be so many different things. It can be a lullaby, it can be a whisper, it can be a yell, it can display every emotion we've ever had. Those are the realities of what the voice can do. And it tries to do that even when we don't have everything lined up. So imagine what it could do if we actually gave it just a little bit more thought. And then here's the other thing that I want to give you as food for thought. Remember we talked about AM radio and how the bandwidth got lowered? I'm going to come back to this because I see Deepa. You're still muted, Deepa.
I try not to have background noise. I think this question ties into what we just talked about and where we're heading. You know, and I kind of struggle with this question as well. The question is, what can I do if you don't like the sound of your voice? I would love to do videos and demos, but I know that my voice doesn't come across well, you know, through this channel, like it's shrilly, and it's like, it's not that I don't like it, I just don't feel comfortable. And so I'm not the only one. There's lots of other people who are feeling. So that's a question, and hopefully you can address that.
Absolutely. So there's two things at play when we're talking about things that we don't like about our own voice, and whether we think our own voice is in some way deficient, whether we think it's shrill or whether we think it's just not nice, whatever it is that you have as an opinion of your voice. So I'll tell you the science part first, because I think it's cool. Everything we think our voice is, everything that we imagine our voice is based on a fiction in our hearing. So when you speak, you hear the sound of your voice coming from inside of the auditory process. And then the sound goes out into the room and it finds hard surfaces and it bounces back and it comes back to your eardrum where it creates the sound again and in a different way. So if you in fact heard your voice the way it was actually happening in the room, there would be a little bit of a time delay, a teeny tiny little echo. And that would probably drive you nuts. I know it would drive me nuts, but your brain's a very clever place. So what your brain does is that it holds the first sound, it waits for the return of the sound, and then it makes a composite sound. But it doesn't necessarily just put those two sounds together, because the sound that comes in from the interior part of your body is coming through bone structure, and it has a weird vibration to it. It's darker, it's heavier, it has a different color. And so it melds with the voice that comes from the outside. And then your brain looks through your auditory cortex, through your library of sounds. And it says, okay, what does she sound like? What does he sound like? And if you haven't heard your voice a lot, if you haven't recorded and played back a lot, what you hear back is a facsimile of a voice that has nothing but those two melded sounds and your opinion about your voice and any other opinion you've ever heard. So if what's in your auditory library, instead of being a series of recordings that you have heard of yourself, if it's instead every opinion you've ever had about your voice and every opinion anybody else has had about your voice, if the auditory cortex says this sound I'm about to hear is shrill, guess what you're going to hear? Shrillness. If the sound in the auditory cortex says that sound is not attractive, it's grating, it's aggressive, it's ugly, that's what you're going to hear because that's what's on file in the auditory cortex. So this is an easy part of this to fix because what you do to make yourself a better library of your voice is to do the thing none of us wants to do, which is to press record and talk every day into a recording and play it back for yourself. Even if it's 10 seconds, record, play, so that you start to recognize yourself in that sound. Now, it could be that as you start to recognize that sound, there are things you want to improve in that sound. But now what you're listening to is more authentic. Then you can say, do I have enough air in that sound? Or is that quite loud enough? Does it sound like that's the right tone for me? Does my voice really sound that low? There's a little raspiness there. Am I okay? You start listening to your voice for the characteristics you'd like to improve instead of with the judgment that comes from lack of recognition in your voice. Does that make sense?
Another question. So what about the tone? And, you know, this is one thing that I get commented a lot on, right? Like, it's like the tone with the way you're speaking and how you're dressing. I'm sure you have a lot to share on that. So can you talk about the tone? Like, is it like a frequency, or is it, you know, how you're thinking? Like, I'm sure the person that asked the question wants to know, and I do too as well.
Excellent. So, and I keep, I'm sorry, my hand keeps moving and it's moving slides when I don't want them to. So tone is an interesting thing because tone is both a specific thing and a perceptual thing. So for example, when I'm speaking, if I were to right now record myself into a spectrograph, it's going to tell me a very specific frequency that I'm speaking at right now. And that specific frequency is the tone, the pitch at which my voice is entering the room. And there will be variability in that. There are highs and lows in how we speak, but there is a center, kind of a through line, a fundamental frequency at which we're entering the room when we speak. So that is a real tone, that is a measurable thing. But there is also a perceived tone, and that's the stuff that we put onto the voice. So it could be that you're entering the room with a lot of energy because you want to be heard in this moment, and that extra push of air could be making your tone a little bit higher off center. You could be entering the room with not enough air support, and so the fundamental tone is fluctuating in a way that seems unsteady. And those are people who are told that they can't be heard or that they're too quiet. That's often an issue there. But tone can also be something societal. And for women in particular, we've been hearing forever that if we want to have authority in the room, that if we want to show that we are powerful, that we should lower our voices to be in a place closer to the range of men. And that is not just untrue, it's criminal. Because again, the female voice has the acoustical advantage in the room. Men have to speak with more effort and more air to match us. So if we try to play at their register, we're actually putting ourselves at a disadvantage when our own tone and frequency is a good spot for us to be in. So that's one of those things that I really think is important when we're talking about tone. It's something that has an actual and a perceptual component, and both of those things are movable. So the reason that so many women speak with low voices now is cultural, it's societal. It's not because those vocal folds really want to make a pitch that low, it's just what's in style right now. And if what suddenly became the style was a higher frequency of pitch, women would speak higher again. The truth is that everybody has variability in the size of our vocal cords and in the structure of our vocal cords. That means there should be a wide spectrum in frequency tone, in what pitch people are speaking on. But tone gets to be much more fun if you start thinking about physical alignment and how much air you have access to. So there were comments earlier about the tone of my voice. This isn't an accident. A long time ago, I realized that I was speaking a lot about physiology and of scientific things, and that I was also trying to get people to change something about themselves. In order for me to be most effective, my voice has to be calming and clear, so that not only does it seem like, oh, she knows what she's doing, her voice is calming and clear, but it makes people more receptive to what I'm trying to get them to take into their lives as a voice practice. So tone has a lot of power. Now, if you doubt that you have the power of tone, I want you to ask yourself these questions. If you have children, how quickly can you get their attention if they are not doing the right thing? If somebody has pushed you past your line of what is acceptable, how quickly does your voice change? If somebody has done something to you that makes you want to hide, how quickly do you get soft? We all command tone. It's just that we're made to believe that it's accidental when it can be something that's completely within our control. So hopefully I can entice you into wanting to be curious about that, because I think that's where really women have this advantage that's not just acoustical, because we have more permission and range for emotional expression in public spheres. It just happens to be that when somebody has decided that one gender is more emotional, you can totally own that. You can say, okay, I have all of the colors. I have a full spectrum. I'm able to make any sound and move this conversation in any direction because I have all of the colors of the rainbow available to me. So I think that's actually a great power that we have. And I really love to help people unlock it for that reason. All right, so we're gonna move on from the acoustical advantage in the room. I'm really thrilled that we could stay here for a while because it remains true. Men have to fight to get to 1,000 hertz. We do it quite naturally, and it is the best frequency for filling a room with sound. So what we're talking about, and what I've been talking about for a little bit, is shifting paradigms. It's shifting the way we think about our voices and shifting the way in which we're willing to enter a room.
We're just want to let you know we're coming up on time quickly. I mean, this is so fascinating. Everyone is loving it. So I think I might be okay going a few minutes over if we need to. But just want to let you know we're coming up on time very quickly.
Absolutely. So we're going to get through some of these this stuff fairly quickly. So what's required now is a shift in paradigm, of course. It's thinking to ourselves, what am I willing to do? What am I willing to risk to enter the room more fully? Because when you enter a room with all of your energy and all of your strength and all of your power underneath you, those of you who have done that, and we've all done it at some point, you're going to get resistance, and it's not necessarily just going to be from the men in the room. That resistance is real because nobody likes to change the status quo. Human beings live by a rule of homeostasis. We want to keep things the same. So deciding to take bigger breaths, to be more dynamic, to send more room, more voice into the room, to take up more space in the room, that's going to shake things up because there are people who are going to think, oh, I can't share the air in this room. There's not enough. But there's plenty. So we just have to shift that paradigm. We have to make it so. And it's not an easy path to walk. So I totally understand any resistance you feel to doing it. It's just you have to check in with yourself and give yourself permission, give yourself consent to take up every last bit of room, every inch of those 1,000 hertz and beyond. Because remember, we're best between 5,000 and 7,000 hertz. Our voices are designed to fill stadiums, not just little conference rooms. All right, so I want to kind of get through a little bit of this. We're not going to be able to jump in depth to content because we've had so much fun talking about voice itself. But when we're talking about what I teach in the studio, it's embodied voice. It's making sure that you're aware, and we've done a lot of that awareness right now. thinking about how do you sound? How does your voice enter your room? What are the vocal cords for? And then once you're aware, you'll start noticing things that you like about your voice and things you don't like about your voice. And when you find things that you want to change, you need to disrupt the habit. And you need to disrupt the habit in such a way that your body can't actually stop you. So I usually use physical activity, I use changing things, I use silliness, I use exercise to create a disruption. And then immediately, once the body's confused, you teach it something else. So if you're out for a jog to disrupt yourself because you're like, I'm not using enough air, before you cool down, stop and say your name. Give your elevator pitch while you're dying for breath. Say something important. Get your body used to using that much air. If you do nothing else, that single disruption is going to set you up for a totally different use of your voice. And then some of the other things that we could get into, articulation and process, how that we get into transformation. These are all things that if we're going to run out of time, go read my blog. There's so much stuff there. You can learn a lot and do this for yourselves. I have faith. All right. And we're going to kind of jump past intention and clarity because again, we're not going to have a lot of time for content, but there's a lot of stuff here. So please, 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 like try to find some way to get yourself into a position where you can access a little bit more clarity about what you want to say in your intention so that you can access the neurological features that will make your voice more powerful. Again, we're lining up all of the parts of the body so that this charge becomes influence in the room. All right, so what happens next? What happens next is that consent. I want you to take a moment right now, and I can't hear you. You just have to like take it with yourself and give yourself permission to take a breath and take up all of the space in the room. You deserve to take up all of the space in the room. And when you do that, the perception of you is going to change. The perception you have of yourself is going to change. And you're going to unlock a different part of yourself. And when you unlock that sense of yourself, it's going to feel really good. And I hope that invites you to open, to be a lion. And notice I use a male lion with the whole mane because, you know, lionesses are super, super cool, but we're going to be the lion in the room. But as we do that, let's do it with kindness. Because the truth is that the first sound every human hears is female. Some of the resistance we feel in the room is because when we speak, we're hard to ignore. There are many people out there who are not used to that invasion into their space. So as we do it a little bit, as we stretch out, as we do it a lot, there's going to be a lot of resistance. So be a benevolent ruler of the acoustic in the room and help those people come along with you as much as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Having said that, I do want to ask one quick question, which is like, is there a way to calm down your voice when you're frustrated, you know, and so your pitch goes higher? Like, how do you bring it back down?
Yeah, so what's happening is that we talked very briefly about the vagus nerve. So that neurological impulse starts getting very overcharged and starts sending overcharged energy directly to the voice box. It's a lot of neurological energy that should go through a big part of your body that's suddenly focused here because you're so frustrated or you're so upset. And what tends to happen is that we try to fight it. And if we try to fight it, we create a little feedback loop, and that's the place where our voice wants to break a little bit, or where tears might come, where suddenly the whole wagon looks like it's going to tip over in the road. And our only defense and our best defense whenever you feel emotion rising is to take the time to take slower breaths. So the only way you're going to regulate your emotional context in that moment is to take breaths that are slower and lower in your body. So I like to do what I call the tight pants test. So that feeling of putting on a pair of pants that are a little bit too tight, when you zip them up, you have to tuck your abdomen a little bit. So thinking that the exhalation has that tuck and that your inhalation is a complete physical release. Deep inhalation, a really contracted, supported exhalation. until you slow yourself down enough to get through that situation.